February 1945 arrived like a long exhale at the end of a brutal war. Across Europe, winter winds swept over ruined cities and frozen fields, carrying with them the faint promise that the end was finally near. The Third Reich was collapsing. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Red Army stood inside the suburbs of Berlin. Yet, beneath this sense of impending victory lay a far greater question, one that could not be settled on any battlefield. It was the question of what the peace would look like, and who would pay the price for it. For that, the Allies traveled to a remote Black Sea resort called Yalta. The Livadia Palace, once a summer refuge for Russian czars, sat under a sky the color of steel. Snow clung to marble balustrades in the forests beyond. It was a beautiful place, but a place out of time, its grandeur scarred by war, its halls cold and echoing, as if history itself were holding its breath. Into this setting came three leaders who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived first, frail and pale after the long journey. Witnesses recalled how he seemed to fold into his wheelchair as attendants wrapped a cape around his thin frame. His troops were advancing across Germany, but the president himself was fading. He had only 2 months left to live, though few knew it. Winston Churchill followed, the heavy coat of his island nation resting on his back. Britain had fought without pause since 1939. 6 years of bombings, rationing, and sacrifice had left London weary. Churchill's determination was undiminished, but the empire he represented was cracking at the edges. And then came Joseph Stalin. He arrived in the strongest position of all, backed by more than 6 million Soviet soldiers and the largest territorial advance in European history. Wherever the Red Army marched, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, local governments fell and new ones rose, aligned with Moscow. Stalin understood power, and he understood the map. In February 1945, both were on his side. The imbalance was immediately apparent. Roosevelt needed Stalin's cooperation to finish the war in the Pacific. Churchill needed him to avoid Soviet dominance in Europe. Stalin needed nothing except time, and the knowledge that his army, not theirs, would reach Berlin first. Outside the palace, the Black Sea churned against the Crimean cliffs. Inside, the three men gathered at a long table draped in white linen. Brass samovars steamed in the cold air. Notebooks opened, translators leaned forward. And the future of Europe, its borders, its governments, even its freedom, hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. The first issue was Poland, a nation broken and rebuilt more times than most empires have existed. It had been the spark that ignited the war, and now it was the spark that threatened to tear the alliance apart. Churchill spoke first, his voice thick with conviction. Britain had gone to war to defend Polish sovereignty. "We cannot," he insisted, "abandon them now." Stalin listened, expression unreadable. Then, in a quiet tone that left no room for argument, he said, "The Soviet Union needed Poland as a buffer. 27 million Soviet citizens had died in the war. The Red Army intended to secure its western frontier permanently." Roosevelt shifted in his chair. His priority was different, the Pacific. His generals believed that an invasion of Japan could cost 500,000 American casualties. If Stalin joined the fight, the war might end months faster. Roosevelt saw in Yalta a narrow path, fragile, imperfect, that might spare American lives. The price, though unspoken, was clear. Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet influence. A young U.S. naval officer assigned to Yalta later remembered the atmosphere in the palace corridors. "It felt," he said, "like watching a storm build through frost-covered windows. You could sense the pressure changing, but no one knew when the glass would break." Throughout the conference, maps were spread, folded, and redrawn. Germany would be divided, Berlin partitioned. Plans for the United Nations were refined. But it was the language about free and unfettered elections in Eastern Europe that carried the true weight and the true danger. The phrase sounded noble. It sounded binding. But everyone understood it was vague enough to hide a world of intentions. Churchill pressed for clarity. Stalin deflected with charm, then with silence. Roosevelt sought compromise. And in the middle of that wintry palace, an unspoken truth settled upon the table. By the time the diplomats finished writing the peace, the soldiers on the ground had already shaped it. In the snowy forests beyond Yalta, the Red Army's artillery thundered toward Berlin. In the west, American and British forces paused at agreed boundaries. Geography was no longer just a map. It was a verdict. As the conference drew to a close, Roosevelt looked out toward the Black Sea, its surface darkening in the late afternoon light. Churchill lit another cigar. Stalin stood quietly, hands behind his back, satisfied. The agreements were signed, the photographs taken. And yet none of the men, not even Stalin, could fully predict how deeply those decisions would carve themselves into the next half-century. But one thing was clear. What happened in that palace would not remain in that palace. It would echo across the ruins of Berlin, the streets of Warsaw, the mountains of Korea, the jungles of Vietnam, and the divided heart of a world entering a new and colder conflict. For all its grandeur, the Livadia Palace possessed a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of thick carpets, shuttered windows, and decisions that traveled farther than the voices that made them. In its long hallways, Allied delegates moved like shadows between sessions, clutching folders heavy with drafts, amendments, and uneasy compromises. Outside, Soviet sentries stood immobile along the stone paths. The message was unmistakable. Yalta was Stalin's ground. Yet inside the palace walls, something subtler unfolded, an invisible negotiation between what the Allies hoped to preserve and what Stalin had already taken. The Red Army's footprint lay across nearly every diplomatic conversation. When Churchill argued for a free Poland with a non-communist cabinet, Stalin's reply was simple and devastating. Poland is a question of life and death for Russia. His words landed with the dull weight of artillery. The Western leaders could state principles, but Stalin held the territory, and territory was leverage. It was during one of the smaller sessions, a gathering of foreign ministers and military advisors, that the fault lines became most visible. A young British officer, assigned to take notes, later described the moment when Vyacheslav Molotov unrolled a new map of Eastern Europe. Its borders were thick, confident strokes of red pencil. The officer wrote, "It was not a proposal, it was a declaration." Every man in the room understood what Molotov's map implied. The Soviet sphere was not a concept. It was a fact, enforced by armies, police, and political committees rising in Warsaw, Bucharest, Sofia, and Budapest. When Roosevelt examined the document, he traced the lines slowly, as though feeling the terrain beneath his fingers. His face betrayed no emotion, only fatigue. One advisor whispered that the president looked as if he were carrying a lifetime in his shoulders. Still, Roosevelt pressed for what he could salvage. If Eastern Europe was slipping beyond Western influence, then at least its future might be shaped through the promise of elections. He stressed the importance of honest ballots, of pluralism, of governance that reflected the people's will. Stalin nodded politely and said little. The silence carried more meaning than any refusal. In another room, Churchill confronted a different tension. His concern was not only geopolitical, but deeply moral. Britain had entered the war for Poland. Now, Poland risked being traded away. "I cannot," he told his staff, "be the undertaker of the Polish nation." Yet even he knew Britain lacked the strength to counter Soviet demands. Years of war had drained its treasury and its empire. Britain was present at Yalta, but its power was fading like embers at dusk. Meanwhile, Soviet influence tightened in ways that did not appear on official agendas. Delegates reported that NKVD officers screened the hotel staff, the drivers, even the carpenters who repaired the palace doors. Every conversation outside formal meetings was conducted under the watchful eyes of Stalin's security services. Nothing was said without calculation. Nothing overheard was forgotten. It was in this atmosphere that small but decisive moments emerged. During one discussion on the future of Romania, an American aide proposed international oversight to ensure fair governance. The suggestion barely left his lips before Molotov dismissed it with a curt wave. "Local matters," he said, "the Romanian people will decide." It was a phrase that comforted no one familiar with the presence of Soviet tanks in Bucharest. On another afternoon, the delegations took a scheduled break. Churchill stepped onto a balcony overlooking the winter coastline. Snow blurred the horizon where sea met sky. A U.S. Army colonel, serving as liaison, joined him briefly. He later recalled the Prime Minister's voice, quiet, weary, stripped of ceremony. "We are shaping a peace that we may not live to defend." The tension between ideals and realities defined every day at Yalta. Roosevelt's vision centered on a peaceful post-war order anchored by the United Nations, a structure he believed could restrain the ambitions of great powers. Churchill fought to preserve democratic footholds in Europe. Stalin focused on security, territorial, political, and absolute. The result was not a compromise, but a layering of intentions. Western principles written onto agreements, Soviet power written onto the ground. As the delegates prepared for their final sessions, the palace felt colder. The fireplaces burned constantly, yet the marble halls seemed to hold the chill of something unspoken. Decisions were being made, but conclusions were becoming clear. The world that would emerge from Yalta would not resemble the world that had entered the war in 1939. And although few realized it then, the silence surrounding Stalin's acquiescence was not agreement. It was strategy. Beyond the palace gates, trains carrying Soviet troops rumbled through the Crimean night, heading west. And in that sound, more than any signature or speech, lay the real shape of Europe's future. The final days at Yalta unfolded beneath a dim winter sun that never seemed to rise fully above the Crimean hills. Delegates moved briskly through the palace corridors, exchanging drafts of communiques, clarifying language, and attempting, sometimes desperately, to pin down assurances that would not remain still. The negotiations had grown more pointed, the stakes more visible. Everyone sensed that the window for influence was narrowing. It was during this stretch of tense diplomacy that the climax of Yalta emerged, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a series of choices made under pressure, fatigue, and the shifting weight of the battlefield. The heart of the conflict lay in the phrase that Western planners hoped could anchor the post-war settlement: free and unfettered elections. It sounded definitive, it sounded hopeful, but behind the polished wording loomed the reality that Soviet power already shaped the terrain where those elections were supposed to occur. On a cold afternoon near the conference's end, the Allied leaders gathered for what would become their most consequential session. Roosevelt, his face drawn with exhaustion, listened as advisors outlined the latest reports from Eastern Europe. In Poland, Soviet-backed officials were consolidating control. In Romania, new people's committees were forming under Red Army supervision. The evidence was plain. Stalin was not waiting for permission to build his sphere. Churchill leaned forward, the glow of his cigar ember pulsing with every gesture. "We must secure a fair chance for these nations," he insisted. "Otherwise, we shall witness the very tyranny we have spent 6 years resisting." Stalin's reply came with a calm that bordered on indifference. "These governments," he said, "must be friendly to the Soviet Union. If they are not, the peace will not hold." Friendly was the word he used. Dependent was the word everyone heard. At that moment, a tension ran through the room, strategic, ideological, and profoundly human. One could almost hear the distant rumble of Soviet artillery advancing westward, a reminder that, for all the diplomatic finesse, the Red Army remained the ultimate arbiter. Roosevelt attempted to bridge the divide. He spoke of cooperation, the necessity of trust, and the promise of the United Nations. His words carried sincerity, even idealism, but behind them lay a practical constraint. The United States was preparing for a massive invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, and American planners believed Soviet participation could shorten the war and spare untold lives. Security in Asia demanded conciliation in Europe. The arithmetic of sacrifice had a logic of its own. The decisive moment arrived not with Roosevelt or Churchill, but with a sheet of paper placed on the table, what would become known as the Yalta Declaration on Liberated Europe. It pledged democratic processes and cooperative oversight. It promised consultation among the Allies if difficulties arose. It set the tone for what the West hoped might be a shared reconstruction. Churchill signed first. Roosevelt followed, his signature neat but faint. Then Stalin added his, a bold, almost sweeping mark across the page. But signatures are fragile things when measured against divisions of armored troops. Across Europe, events were moving faster than diplomacy. Even as the ink dried, Soviet police were arresting non-communist leaders in Warsaw. Red Army commanders were determining who could speak, who could organize, who could lead. Stalin understood the central truth of post-war politics. Whoever controlled the streets controlled the future. A senior British diplomat later wrote, "We drafted sentences. The Soviets drafted governments." The climax of Yalta became clear not in what was agreed upon, but in what could no longer be altered. The Allies had bargained for principles, Stalin had bargained for territory, and he held the stronger hand. As the conference adjourned, Roosevelt addressed his advisors softly. "We must give this a chance to work." His hope was genuine. He believed that, in time, the mechanisms of the United Nations and the pressure of international diplomacy could restrain Soviet expansion. Churchill was less convinced. Observers noted the somber look on his face as he packed his papers, as though he sensed that an old world was slipping away. The Europe of independent states, of balances of power, of sovereign borders not dictated by distant capitals. Stalin, for his part, left Yalta without hesitation. The outcomes had aligned almost perfectly with Soviet aims. His motorcade rolled away from the palace, past rows of soldiers standing rigid in the snow, toward a front line soon to become a new frontier. In the stillness after the delegations departed, the palace felt strangely emptied, the echoes of footsteps fading down long marble halls. Outside, the Black Sea stirred beneath a gray horizon. The bargains had been made, but the question of whether they could hold would not be settled by diplomats. It would be settled by history. When the final motorcade departed Yalta, the quiet that settled over the Livadia Palace felt almost unnatural. The snow along the terraces had begun to melt, dripping beneath the carved stone railings like a slow clock. Servants cleared the long tables. Stenographers boxed their notes. The conference rooms emptied, leaving only the faint scent of cigar smoke and a small stack of signed agreements. Agreements that, in time, would bear more weight than the men who drafted them ever imagined. Yet the real story of Yalta did not unfold in those rooms. It unfolded in the world the delegates returned to. By early March 1945, Red Army checkpoints were appearing across Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Local councils, some democratic, many not, were reorganized under Soviet supervision. Security officers from the NKVD moved quietly through towns and villages, identifying potential opponents, gathering dossiers, and shaping the political landscape long before any election could be held. The Western Allies watched, protested, and sent diplomatic notes. The Soviets replied with politeness and continued unchanged. In Washington, Roosevelt briefed Congress on the Yalta agreements with a tone of guarded optimism. He spoke of unity, peace, and the promise of the United Nations. To a nation weary from years of war, his message carried comfort. Few Americans knew the extent of Soviet control already hardening in the East. Fewer still imagined how enduring that control would become. But some did. Within the U.S. Army, officers stationed in Germany and Czechoslovakia reported uneasy encounters along the new boundary lines. Patrols sent to inspect bridges found Soviet troops already dug in. Political committees sprouted in towns the Red Army had liberated, but the word liberation seemed to lose its meaning. One American intelligence officer wrote in his diary, "We are witnessing the replacement of one occupation with another." Across the Atlantic, Churchill felt the shift even more keenly. He had left Yalta with hope, fragile hope, that the Soviets might honor their promises. But as telegrams from Eastern Europe filled his desk, the hope frayed. In a moment of rare vulnerability, he confided to an aide that an iron curtain is descending across the continent. It would take another year before he spoke those words publicly. But the realization began here, in the weeks after Yalta. For Stalin, the post-Yalta world required no rethinking. He acted with the confidence of a man whose armies had redrawn the map. The agreement served as diplomatic cover for what Soviet power would enforce on the ground. His goal was simple: create a buffer zone of friendly or dependent states to shield the Soviet Union from any future invasion. In his view, security demanded control, and control demanded obedience. Thus began the slow solidification of a divided Europe. In the American occupation zones, troops distributed food and helped restore civil institutions. In the Soviet zones, factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Political purges began. Newspapers were censored, borders tightened. Even families found themselves cut between newly drawn lines. And still, the world clung to the belief that peace had been secured. The illusion held until April 1945, when Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia. His passing marked the end of the administration that had crafted the Yalta agreements. To many, it signaled the beginning of a different era, one less optimistic, more cautious, and increasingly aware of the emerging Soviet challenge. As President Truman settled into office, he inherited not only the war against Japan, but a diplomatic landscape already shaped by Yalta's compromises. His advisors briefed him on events in Eastern Europe. Some spoke bluntly, others urged restraint, but all agreed on one point: the partnership with Stalin was unraveling. The unraveling accelerated quickly. Within a year, free elections in Eastern Europe proved illusory. Opposition leaders disappeared. Communist parties, backed by Soviet police, secured control from Warsaw to Sofia. What had been predicted at Yalta became undeniable. Among American commanders in Europe, one voice carried a particular resonance. General George S. Patton, long skeptical of Soviet intentions, regarded the developments as confirmation of his deepest fears. "We have yielded too much to gain too little," he wrote in a private note weeks before his death. His viewpoint was controversial, even reckless to some, but history would grant it a sharper clarity. By 1947, as the Truman Doctrine took shape and the Marshall Plan emerged, Western leaders recognized that the world had entered a new conflict, one waged not by tanks, but by ideology, alliances, and influence. The Cold War had begun, not with a declaration, but with the quiet realization that the promises of Yalta could not be reconciled with Stalin's ambitions. Looking back, historians often describe Yalta in contrasting terms: a betrayal, a necessary compromise, a diplomatic failure, a pragmatic acceptance of military realities. In truth, it was all of these, and none entirely. Yalta was the moment when victory collided with exhaustion, when ideals met geography, and when wartime alliances strained under the weight of incompatible futures. Its legacy lived on in the Iron Curtain, in NATO and the Warsaw Pact, in Berlin's divided streets, and in every flashpoint of the Cold War. The world that emerged from the Crimean winter of 1945 was not the world the Allies had hoped to build. It was the world their armies had carved. And from the quiet halls of the Livadia Palace, its echo traveled across the next half-century, a reminder that even in peace, the lines drawn by power rarely fade.